Chapter 1. Chinese Realpolitik and Sun Tzu's Art of War. The Chinese have been shrewd practitioners of realpolitik and students of a strategic doctrine distinctly different from the strategy and diplomacy that found favor in the West. A turbulent history has taught Chinese leaders that not every problem has a solution and that too great an emphasis on total mastery over specific events could upset the harmony of the universe. There were too many potential enemies for the empire ever to live in total security. If China's fate was relative security, it also implied relative insecurity, the need to learn the grammar of over a dozen neighboring states with significantly different histories and aspirations. Rarely did Chinese statesmen risk the outcome of a conflict on a single all-or-nothing clash. Elaborate multi-year maneuvers were closer to their style. Where the Western tradition prized the decisive clash of forces emphasizing feats of heroism, the Chinese ideal stressed subtlety, indirection, and the patient accumulation of relative advantage. This contrast is reflected in the respective intellectual games favored by each civilization. China's most enduring game is Wei Qi, pronounced roughly Wei Qi, and often known in the West by a variation of its Japanese name, Go. Wei Qi translates as a game of surrounding pieces. It implies a concept of strategic encirclement. The board, a grid of 19 by 19 lines, begins empty. Each player has 180 pieces, or stones, at his disposal, each of equal value with the others. The players take turns placing stones at any point on the board, building up positions of strength while working to encircle and capture the opponent's stones. Multiple contests take place simultaneously in different regions of the board. The balance of forces shifts incrementally with each move, as the players implement strategic plans and react to each other's initiatives. At the end of a well-played game, the board is filled by partially interlocking areas of strength. The margin of advantage is often slim, and to the untrained eye, the identity of the winner is not always immediately obvious. Chess, on the other hand, is about total victory. The purpose of the game is checkmate, to put the opposing king into a position where he cannot move without being destroyed. The vast majority of games end in total victory achieved by attrition or, more rarely, a dramatic, skillful maneuver. The only other possible outcome is a draw, meaning the abandonment of the hope for victory by both parties. If chess is about the decisive battle, Wei Qi is about the protracted campaign. The chess player aims for total victory. The Wei Qi player seeks relative advantage. In chess, the player always has the capability of the adversary in front of him, all the pieces are always fully deployed. The Wei Qi player needs to assess not only the pieces on the board but the reinforcements the adversary is in a position to deploy. Chess teaches the Clausewitzian concepts of center of gravity and the decisive point, the game usually beginning as a struggle for the center of the board. Wei Qi teaches the art of strategic encirclement. Where the skillful chess player aims to eliminate his opponent's pieces in a series of head-on clashes, a talented Wei Qi player moves into empty spaces on the board, gradually mitigating the strategic potential of his opponent's pieces. Chess produces single-mindedness, Wei Qi generates strategic flexibility. A similar contrast exists in the case of China's distinctive military theory. Its foundations were laid during a period of upheaval, when ruthless struggles between rival kingdoms decimated China's population. Reacting to this slaughter, and seeking to emerge victorious from it, Chinese thinkers developed strategic thought that placed a premium on victory through psychological advantage and preached the avoidance of direct conflict. The seminal figure in this tradition is known to history as Sun Tzu, or Master Sun, author of the famed treatise The Art of War. Intriguingly, no one is sure exactly who he was. Since ancient times, scholars have debated the identity of The Art of War's author and the date of its composition. The book presents itself as a collection of sayings by one Sun Wu, a general and wandering military advisor from the spring and autumn period of Chinese history, 770 to 476 BC, as recorded by his disciples. Some Chinese and later Western scholars have questioned whether such a master-son existed or, if he did, whether he was in fact responsible for the art of war's contents. Well over 2,000 years after its composition, this volume of epigrammatic observations on strategy, diplomacy, and war, written in classical Chinese, halfway between poetry and prose, remains a central text of military thought. Its maxims found vivid expression in the 20th century Chinese Civil War at the hands of Sun Tzu's student Mao Zedong, and in the Vietnam Wars, as Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap employed Sun Tzu's principles of indirect attack and psychological combat against France and then the United States. Sun Tzu has also achieved a second career of sorts in the West, with popular editions of The Art of War recasting him as a modern business management guru. Even today Sun Tzu's text reads with a degree of immediacy and insight that places him among the ranks of the world's foremost strategic thinkers. One could argue that the disregard of his precepts was importantly responsible for America's frustration in its Asian wars. What distinguishes Sun Tzu from Western writers on strategy is the emphasis on the psychological and political elements over the purely military. The great European military theorists Karl von Clausewitz and Antoine-Henri Jomini treat strategy as an activity in its own right, separate from politics. Even Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is the continuation of politics by other means implies that with war the statesman enters a new and distinct phase. Sun Tzu merges the two fields. Where Western strategists reflect on the means to assemble superior power at the decisive point, Sun Tzu addresses the means of building a dominant political and psychological position, such that the outcome of a conflict becomes a foregone conclusion. Western strategists test their maxims by victories in battles, Sun Tzu tests by victories where battles have become unnecessary. Sun Tzu's text on war does not have the quality of exaltation of some European literature on the subject, nor does it appeal to personal heroism. Its somber quality is reflected in the portentous opening of The Art of War. War is a grave affair of the state. It is a place of life and death, a road to survival and extinction, a matter to be pondered carefully. And because the consequences of war are so grave, prudence is the value most to be cherished. A ruler must never mobilize his men out of anger. A general must never engage in battle out of spite. Anger can turn to pleasure. Spite can turn to joy. But a nation destroyed cannot be put back together again. A dead man cannot be brought back to life. So the enlightened ruler is prudent. The effective general is cautious. This is the way to keep a nation at peace and an army intact. What should a statesman be prudent about? For Sun Tzu, victory is not simply the triumph of armed forces. Instead, it is the achievement of the ultimate political objectives that the military clash was intended to secure. Far better than challenging the enemy on the field of battle is undermining an enemy's morale or maneuvering him into an unfavorable position from which escape is impossible. Because war is a desperate and complex enterprise, self-knowledge is crucial. Strategy resolves itself into a psychological contest. Ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but in defeating the enemy without ever fighting. The highest form of warfare is to attack the enemy's strategy itself. The next, to attack his alliances. The next, to attack armies. The lowest form of war is to attack cities. Siege warfare is a last resort. The skillful strategist defeats the enemy without doing battle, captures the city without laying siege, overthrows the enemy state without protracted war. Ideally, the commander would achieve a position of such dominance that he could avoid battle entirely. Or else he would use arms to deliver a coup de grace after extensive analysis and logistical, diplomatic, and psychological preparation. Thus, Sun Tzu's counsel that the victorious army is victorious first, and seeks battle later. The defeated army does battle first, and seeks victory later. Because attacks on an opponent's strategy and his alliances involve psychology and perception, Sun Tzu places considerable emphasis on the use of subterfuge and misinformation. When able, he counseled, feign inability. When deploying troops, appear not to be. When near, appear far. When far, appear near. To the commander following Sun Tzu's precepts, a victory achieved indirectly through deception or manipulation is more humane, and surely more economical, than a triumph by superior force. The art of war advises the commander to induce his opponent into accomplishing the commander's own aims or force him into a position so impossible, that he opts to surrender his army or state unharmed. Perhaps Sun Tzu's most important insight was that in a military or strategic contest, everything is relevant and connected: weather, terrain, diplomacy, the reports of spies and double agents, supplies and logistics, the balance of forces, historic perceptions, the intangibles of surprise and morale. Each factor influences the others, giving rise to subtle shifts in momentum and relative advantage. There are no isolated events. Hence the task of a strategist is less to analyze a particular situation than to determine its relationship to the context in which it occurs. No particular constellation is ever static, any pattern is temporary and in essence evolving. The strategist must capture the direction of that evolution and make it serve his ends. Sun Tzu uses the word shi for that quality, a concept with no direct Western counterpart. In the military context, she connotes the strategic trend and potential energy of a developing situation, the power inherent in the particular arrangement of elements and its developmental tendency. In the art of war, the word connotes the ever-changing configuration of forces as well as their general trend. To Sun Tzu, the strategist mastering shi is akin to water flowing downhill, automatically finding the swiftest and easiest course. A successful commander waits before charging headlong into battle. He shies away from an enemy's strength, he spends his time observing and cultivating changes in the strategic landscape. He studies the enemy's preparations and his morale, husbands resources and defines them carefully, and plays on his opponent's psychological weaknesses, until at last he perceives the opportune moment to strike the enemy at his weakest point. He then deploys his resources, swiftly and suddenly, rushing downhill along the path of least resistance, in an assertion of superiority that careful timing and preparation have rendered a fait accompli. The art of war articulates a doctrine less of territorial conquest than of psychological dominance. It was the way the North Vietnamese fought America, though Hanoi usually translated its psychological gains into actual territorial conquests as well. In general, Chinese statesmanship exhibits a tendency to view the entire strategic landscape as part of a single whole, good and evil, near and far, strength and weakness, past and future all interrelated. In contrast to the Western approach of treating history as a process of modernity achieving a series of absolute victories over evil and backwardness, the traditional Chinese view of history emphasized a cyclical process of decay and rectification, in which nature and the world can be understood but not completely mastered. The best that can be accomplished is to grow into harmony with it. Strategy and statecraft become means of combative coexistence with opponents. The goal is to maneuver them into weakness while building up one's own shi, or strategic position. This maneuvering approach is, of course, the ideal and not always the reality. Throughout their history, the Chinese have had their share of unsubtle and brutal conflicts, both at home and occasionally abroad. Once these conflicts erupted, such as during the unification of China under the Qin dynasty, the clashes of the Three Kingdoms period, the quelling of the Taiping Rebellion, and the 20th century Civil War, China was subjected to wholesale loss of life on a level comparable to the European World Wars. The bloodiest conflicts occurred as a result of the breakdown of the internal Chinese system, in other words, as an aspect of internal adjustments of a state for which domestic stability and protection against looming foreign invasion are equal concerns. For China's classical sages, the world could never be conquered, wise rulers could hope only to harmonize with its trends. There was no new world to populate, no redemption awaiting mankind on distant shores. The promised land was China, and the Chinese were already there. The blessings of the Middle Kingdom's culture might theoretically be extended, by China's superior example, to the foreigners on the empire's periphery. But there was no glory to be found in venturing across the seas to convert heathens to Chinese ways. The customs of the Celestial dynasty were plainly beyond the attainment of the far barbarians. This may be the deeper meaning of China's abandonment of its naval tradition. Lecturing in the 1820s on his philosophy of history, the German philosopher Hegel described the Chinese tendency to see the huge Pacific Ocean to their east as a barren waste. He noted that China, by and large, did not venture to the seas and instead depended on its great landmass. The land imposed an infinite multitude of dependencies, whereas the sea propelled people beyond these limited circles of thought and action. This stretching out of the sea beyond the limitations of the land, is wanting to the splendid political edifices of Asiatic states, although they themselves border on the sea, as for example, China. For them the sea is only the limit, the ceasing of the land, they have no positive relations to it. The West had set sail to spread its trade and values throughout the world. In this respect, Hegel argued, land-bound China, which in fact had once been the world's greatest naval power, was severed from the general historical development. With these distinctive traditions and millennial habits of superiority, China entered the modern age a singular kind of empire. A state claiming universal relevance for its culture and institutions but making few efforts to proselytize. The wealthiest country in the world but one that was indifferent to foreign trade and technological innovation. A culture of cosmopolitanism overseen by a political elite oblivious to the onset of the Western age of exploration. And a political unit of unparalleled geographic extent that was unaware of the technological and historical currents that would soon threaten its existence.